The cast-iron gates of the Vance estate did not just keep the world out, they locked the silence in. Maren stood on the gravel driveway, her knuckles white around the handles of two battered canvas bags. Her worn shoes offered little protection against the bite of the late October chill, but her throat felt bone-dry for an entirely different reason. As an unbonded Omega from the decaying industrial towns 3 hours south, survival meant staying invisible. It meant keeping her shoulders rounded, her eyes fixed on the floorboards, and her scent buried under cheap suppressant patches. "You're late by 4 minutes, Vance," the head housekeeper, a sharp-faced beta named Mrs. Gable, said without looking up from her tablet. "Follow me, Miss Silas does not tolerate disorder." Maren swallowed hard, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She hurried down the cavernous, marble-paved hallway, where every footstep echoed like a strike against glass. The air in the mansion smelled of polished mahogany, expensive white lilies, and something cold, something that made the small hairs on Maren's arms stand up. They stopped before a set of massive, dark wood double doors at the end of the west wing. Mrs. Gable knocked twice, precise and unhurried, before pushing one door open. "The new evening maid, Miss Silas." Maren stepped into the private library, her breath catching in her chest. The room was vast, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, but it felt claustrophobically tight the moment Maren raised her gaze. Standing by the tall, arched window was Silas Vance. Silas was everything the media claimed and worse. Tall, impeccably tailored in a crisp charcoal suit, her silver-blonde hair swept back without a single strand out of place. Her presence as a highborn alpha was subtle but suffocating, a quiet, heavy pressure that made Maren's stomach twist into a knot. Silas turned slowly, holding a set of heavy architectural blueprints. Her slate-gray eyes swept over Maren, lingering for a fraction of a second on Maren's frayed collar before settling on her face. "Your name," Silas said. Her voice was low, smooth, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Maren, ma'am," Maren whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Maren Vance." Silas's left eyebrow twitched up barely a millimeter. "We share a surname, a common one in the valley." "Yes, ma'am." "You will be responsible for this room, the study, and my private quarters," Silas said, stepping forward. The leather of her shoes clicked softly against the hardwood. She stopped just 2 feet away from Maren. Silas reached out, her long, pale fingers hovering an inch from Maren's shoulder. For one agonizing second, Maren thought the noble alpha was going to touch her. Maren froze, her breath holding in her chest. Instead, Silas pinched a stray piece of lint from Maren's apron strap and stepped back, her expression unreadable. "Ensure the desk is dusted by 7 every evening. Do not touch the blue-bound folders. You may begin." By her 3rd week at the estate, Maren learned the unspoken rules of Silas Vance's life. Silas slept 4 hours a night. She did not eat breakfast. She received calls from her mother, Eleanor Vance, every afternoon at 3, calls that left Silas standing at the window for long minutes afterward, her jaw set so hard the muscle flexed beneath her pale skin. Maren stayed invisible. She polished the silver, wiped the dust from priceless glass antiques, and kept her head down. But invisible as she tried to be, she couldn't stop watching. She watched the subtle slump in Silas's broad shoulders when the heavy oak doors closed, shielding her from the rest of the family. She watched the way Silas's fingers would trace the edge of her architectural sketches, her eyes softening with a strange, tragic longing before hardening back into stone whenever a servant entered. It was a rainy Tuesday night when the rhythm broke. A violent thunderstorm roared off the coast, rattling the tall leaded windows of the library. It was past 11, long after Maren's shift had officially ended, but she knew Silas was still inside. Maren carried a fresh pot of black tea on a silver tray, her hands trembling slightly as a harsh crack of thunder shook the floorboards. She pushed the library door open softly. Silas was not at her desk. She was sitting on the leather sofa near the fireplace, her suit jacket discarded, her crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. Her head was bowed, resting in her hands. Maren hesitated at the threshold, her stomach tightening with a sudden wave of vulnerability. She had never seen the formidable alpha look so human. "I brought your tea, Miss Silas," Maren said quietly. Silas didn't look up immediately. "I didn't request it." You usually have trouble sleeping when it rains," Maren blurted out before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air, intimate and terrifyingly bold. Silas slowly lifted her head. Her gray eyes were bloodshot, shadowed with an exhaustion so deep it made Maren's chest ache. Silas's gaze locked onto Maren's, lingering on her lips, then rising to her eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged, until Maren felt her cheeks burning under the intense, unblinking focus. "You notice a lot, Maren," Silas said softly. Maren set the tray on the coffee table, her hands shaking so badly the porcelain teacup rattled against the saucer. "I'm sorry, I'll leave." "Stay." The command was quiet, but it pulled at Maren like an anchor. She stood rooted to the spot as Silas leaned forward, picking up the teacup. As Silas took it, her bare fingers brushed against the back of Maren's hand. The contact was brief, a fleeting touch of warm skin against cold, but a sharp, electrical shock zipped straight up Maren's arm. Maren gasped softly, pulling her hand back into her apron pockets, her pulse racing wildly against her ribs. Silas didn't pull away. Her fingers hovered over the silver tray where Maren's hand had just been, her eyes darkening slightly before she took a slow sip of the tea. "It's good," Silas murmured, setting the cup down. "Sit." "Miss Silas, I'm just the maid." "There is no one else in this house who looks at me without calculating what I am worth," Silas interrupted, her voice dropping an octave. "Sit for 5 minutes. That is an order." Maren sat on the far edge of the sofa, her posture rigid, her muscles strained with cold panic and a strange, terrifying warmth. For 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. The sound of rain lashing against the glass filled the vast room. Maren kept her eyes glued to her lap, but she could feel Silas's presence beside her, a radiant, quiet heat that made her skin prickle. "My mother wants me to merge our firm with the Sterling family," Silas said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Her voice was flat, but her hand clenched tight into a fist against her knee. A marriage of convenience, a surrender. Maren turned her head, surprised by the sudden confession. "Do you want to?" Silas turned to look at her, a faint, bitter smile touching her lips. "Does it look like I want to?" "You could say no," Maren said softly, her heart aching for the composed woman who looked so trapped in her own golden cage. "You own your life." "I own nothing," Silas replied softly. "Everything you see belongs to the Vance name, not to me." Silas shifted, turning her body toward Maren. She lifted a hand, her long fingers reaching out slowly, halting just millimeters away from Maren's jawline. She didn't close the gap, but the heat radiating from her skin made Maren's throat go dry. Maren didn't pull away this time. She leaned in slightly, drawn by an irresistible, dangerous gravity. Before Silas's thumb could touch Maren's skin, a sharp knock echoed from the library door. Silas dropped her hand instantly, her face snapping back into an emotionless mask of marble. "Enter." A young footman stepped in, bowing nervously. "Forgive the interruption, Miss Silas. Your mother is calling on the secure line from London." Silas closed her eyes for a brief second, a flicker of profound pain crossing her features before she stood up. "I will take it in my office." She didn't look at Maren again as she walked out, but the lingering scent of cedarwood left Maren gasping for air in the quiet room. 2 days later, the quiet dynamic exploded. It was late afternoon when Maren was summoned to Silas's private study to clean up after a meeting with the family lawyers. The room was a disaster, papers scattered across the desk, empty glasses left on the table. Maren began gathering the files, stacking them neatly. As she lifted a heavy leather-bound folder, a loose piece of official parchment slipped out and fell to the floor. Maren knelt to pick it up. Her eyes caught the bold black heading at the top, confidential asset liquidation and workforce termination. She didn't mean to read it, but her own hometown's name leaped out at her from the page. Oak Haven Manufacturing Plant. Maren's blood ran cold. Her stomach dropped into a bottomless pit as her eyes skimmed the fine print. The Vance Aldridge estate was buying out the primary employer in Maren's hometown, the very factory where her elderly father and dozens of families worked, and planned to shut it down entirely to cut corporate tax liabilities. The authorization signature at the bottom, written in sharp, decisive black ink, was Silas Vance, S. "What are you doing?" Maren jumped, dropping the paper as Silas stepped into the study, closing the heavy door behind her. Maren stood up, her legs shaking, her hands trembling so hard she had to clench them into fists. Cold panic turned into a sudden, blinding wave of betrayal. "You're destroying them," Maren breathed, her voice cracking. "Oakhaven, my father works there. Everyone I know lives there." Silas's expression remained terrifyingly blank, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "You are reading confidential corporate documents, Maren. Put it down." "Is this who you are?" Maren stepped forward, forgetting the class boundary, forgetting her place, driven by a raw, bleeding anger. Tears burned behind her eyes. "You sit here in your silk suits acting like a victim because your mother pressures you, while you sign away the lives of thousands of people with a stroke of a pen. You do not understand the situation," Silas started, her tone clipped. "I understand that you lied," Maren yelled, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I thought you were different. I thought you had a soul under all that ice." Silas snapped. In one swift, fluid motion, Silas bridged the distance between them. She grabbed Maren's wrists, pinning them lightly against the edge of the tall wooden bookcase behind her. Maren gasped, her back slamming against the leather-bound books. Silas's body was pressed flush against hers, trapping her completely. The raw, unbridled power of an alpha's fury rolled off Silas in waves, thick and suffocating, but beneath the anger, Silas's chest was heaving, her breath coming in ragged, desperate hitches. "Look at me," Silas commanded, her voice dropping into a harsh, trembling whisper. Maren lifted her tear-filled eyes, her heart beating so violently against her ribs she thought it would burst. Silas was staring down at her gray eyes burning with an intense, terrifying fire. Her grip on Maren's wrists wasn't painful, but it was absolute. Silas leaned down, her face inches from Maren's, her gaze dropping to Maren's trembling lips. "You think I want to do this?" Silas whispered, her hot breath fanning across Maren's burning skin. "You think I have a choice?" "You always have a choice," Maren sobbed, trying to pull away, but the proximity was intoxicating, dangerous, and overwhelming. Silas didn't let go. Instead, she leaned closer, dipping her head until her forehead pressed against Maren's. The physical contact was so sudden, so intensely intimate, that Maren froze, a shudder running down her spine. Silas's eyes closed, her composure completely shattering for one brief, agonizing second as a desperate, quiet groan escaped her throat. "I am trying to save them, you fool," Silas breathed against Maren's skin, her thumb brushing over the pulse point on Maren's wrist. "My mother wants to declare bankruptcy and leave them with nothing. I am signing the buyout to pay their pensions out of my personal account." Maren's breath hitched in her throat. Her mind went completely blank, the anger evaporating into a terrifying, dizzying shock. Silas opened her eyes, staring deeply into Maren's, their lips barely a breath apart. For a single, suspended second, the universe shrank down to the heat of Silas's body, the desperate pulse in her throat, and the raw, dangerous need hanging in the air between them. Then, Silas's gaze shifted to the door behind Maren, and her entire body went dead rigid. Standing in the open doorway of the study was a leaner Vance, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with cold, lethal disgust. The air in the study turned sub-zero the second a leaner Vance stepped into the doorway. Her sharp, calculating eyes traveled from Silas's hands, still pinning Maren's wrists to the bookshelf, down to their breath mingling in the narrow gap between them. Silas released Maren instantly, stepping back with a smooth, terrifyingly fast return to composure. Her posture snapped straight, her hands smoothing the front of her suit, though the rapid pulse ticking in her jaw betrayed her. "Mother," Silas said, her voice dropping into a flat, icy register. "You arrived early." "Clearly," Elena replied, her tone dripping with quiet venom as she glanced at Maren. "I see you're allowing the staff to handle confidential documents. Leave us, girl." Maren didn't need to be told twice. Her face burning, her chest tight with a frantic mix of shock and fear, she gathered the scattered papers with trembling hands and fled into the hall. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not just from Eleanor's lethal glare, but from the lingering impression of Silas's body against hers, and the unbelievable truth Silas had whispered in her ear. She isn't shutting down Oakhaven, she's saving it. Over the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the estate shifted from cold distance to a heavy, suffocating awareness. Silas, shielding Maren from her mother, had carved a dangerous crack in the wall between them. Every time they passed each other in the long corridors, the air felt charged, thick with unspoken thoughts. Late one evening, Maren was finishing her rounds in Silas's private drawing room. Silas sat at her grand mahogany desk, unbuttoned down to her collarbones, working under the low glow of a bronze lamp. Maren stepped forward to set a fresh pitcher of water on the desk. As she reached across, her fingers accidentally brushed against Silas's forearm. Silas froze mid-sentence, her pen hovering over the document. Her gray eyes locked onto Maren's, wide and dark in the dim light. The silence stretched until Maren forgot how to breathe, the warmth of Silas's skin sending a sharp, intoxicating electric current straight down her spine. Silas didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes dropped slowly to Maren's mouth before she forced herself to exhale sharply and look back at her blueprints. "You're working too late," Maren whispered, her throat dry. "I have a firm to protect," Silas murmured, her voice lower than usual, "and people depending on me." Maren's chest tightened with a surge of bittersweet affection. She reached down, picked up a discarded blueprint that had rolled onto the floor, and carefully unrolled it. It wasn't a corporate building. It was a modest, beautiful home perched on a coastal cliff, designed with wide windows and simple, warm wooden beams. "What is this?" Maren asked softly. Silas leaned back, her composure slipping just enough to reveal a raw, aching exhaustion. "Something that isn't for my mother, a place where I don't have to be a Vance." She looked up at Maren, her expression terrifyingly open. "A place where someone could just live." Maren's stomach did a nervous, fluttering flip. For a fleeting second, the quiet intimacy between them felt almost like a life they could share, a fragile fantasy built in secret. In the weeks that followed, the boundary between Alpha and Maid blurred beyond recognition. Quiet conversations in the dead of night turned into lingering touches in shadowed corners. The restraint holding them back eroded piece by piece until, behind the locked doors of Silas's private quarters, the unspoken dynamic finally broke. It was a night of quiet, breathless surrender. Silas, usually so untouchable and rigid, handled Maren as if she were made of glass, her hands trembling as she pulled Maren into the dark, hiding from the world outside. The memory of that night, the lingering scent of cedarwood, the heat of Silas's skin, and the raw, soft whispers exchanged in the dark, marked Maren forever. 3 weeks later, the dream shattered. Maren stood in the small staff bathroom on the lower floor, staring down at the thin white plastic stick in her hand. 2 crisp red lines glared back at her. Her breath hitched. A wave of cold panic washed over her, followed immediately by a terrifying, dizzying warmth. She was an unbonded Omega. Silas was a highborn noble. An unsanctioned child between them was a scandal that could ruin Silas and destroy Maren's life entirely. Her hands shaking violently, Maren pressed the test against her chest and leaned against the sink, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. She needed to tell Silas. They needed to figure this out together. Maren hurried upstairs, her throat bone dry, her stomach churning with nervous nausea. She approached the library doors, ready to knock, when the sharp, panicked sound of raised voices stopped her in her tracks. "She's dead, Silas. The police just called." It was Aliner's voice, shrill and completely devoid of its usual composure. Maren paused, her hand hovering an inch from the heavy oak door. "What are you saying?" Silas's voice sounded hollow, stripped of all authority. "Julian's car went over the embankment near the North Cliff," Aliner cried, her voice trembling with manic desperation. "Your sister is gone. The line is broken. The Sterling family is withdrawing their investment by midnight unless the contract is signed." Through the small gap in the double doors, Maren saw Silas collapse back against her desk, her face drained of all color, her eyes wide with total shock. Julian, her younger sister, the only family member Silas truly loved, was dead. "You have no choice now, Silas," Aliner hissed, leaning over her daughter like a vulture. "Julian was supposed to marry into the Sterling estate to secure our debt. Now it has to be you. You will sign the betrothal contract, or the banks will seize everything we own by morning." Silas sat completely frozen, her jaw trembling, her eyes staring blankly at the wall. The weight of her entire family's survival slammed down on her broad shoulders, threatening to crush her completely. Maren's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as she watched from the shadows. She squeezed the pregnancy test tight in her pocket, the hard plastic biting into her palm. She took a step toward the door, desperate to run to Silas, to wrap her arms around her and pull her out of the nightmare. As if sensing her presence, Silas turned her head toward the door. Through the crack, their eyes met. Silas's gray eyes were brimming with unshed tears, filled with an agonizing, silent plea. Maren stood frozen, her chest heaving, the secret in her pocket burning against her skin. Silas slowly lifted a single hand toward the door, her fingers trembling in the empty air, a silent, desperate reach across the impossible chasm opening between them. Then a leaner slammed the heavy folder down onto the desk, blocking Silas's view, and forced a pen into her hand. The week following Julian's funeral was an agonizing blur of black veils, quiet whispers, and suffocating pressure. Silas barely slept. She walked through the estate like a ghost in tailored wool, her face an unreadable mask of ice. But whenever she entered her private library, her gaze instinctively sought Maren. The unsaid truth hung heavy between them. Maren carried their child, while Silas was being systematically pushed toward a dynastic union with the Sterling family. Late on a rain-slicked Thursday evening, Silas summoned Maren to her private study. When Maren entered, closing the door behind her, Silas didn't speak immediately. She stood by the desk, her crisp white collar undone, her eyes shadowed with bone-deep exhaustion. She motioned for Maren to step closer. Maren approached, her stomach twisting into anxious knots. Her hand rested instinctively over her lower abdomen. "Silas, you haven't slept in days." Silas didn't answer with words. She reached out, her long fingers brushing gently against Maren's jawline, tracing the soft curve down to her chin. The touch was so tender, so desperately reverent, that Maren's breath hitched in her throat. Silas's thumb brushed Maren's trembling lower lip, lingering for a suspended second. Maren leaned into the warmth, her heart pounding against her ribs, expecting Silas to pull her close. Instead, Silas dropped her hand, stepping back into the shadow of her mahogany desk. The sudden coldness left Maren's skin prickling with longing and fear. "I made a deal with my mother," Silas said, her voice dropping into a low, gravelly whisper. Maren's throat went bone dry. "What kind of deal?" "She wants the Sterling merger to save our family's corporate assets," Silas said, staring at her own clenching fist. "I agreed to announce the betrothal at the winter gala next week, but under one condition." Silas looked up, her gray eyes burning with a fierce, quiet intensity. "I forced her to sign a binding legal covenant. A private estate in the countryside, deeded entirely in your name, along with a permanent trust fund. You and our child will be completely safe. My mother will never be able to touch you, control you, or take what is ours." Maren stared at her, shock turning into a cold, sickening panic. "A private cottage? Silas, you're talking about hiding me away like a secret. You're talking about marrying someone else." "It is the only way to protect you." Silas's composure cracked, a rare, raw strain bleeding into her tone. She took a step toward Maren, her voice dropping lower. "If my mother finds out about the baby before this merger is finalized, she will use every legal weapon in her power to destroy your reputation and strip your parental rights as an unbonded Omega. I am buying your freedom with my own life, Maren. I don't want a trust fund. I don't want a golden cage." Tears burned behind Maren's eyes, her chest heaving. "I wanted you." Silas stood frozen, her jaw set so tight a muscle twitched in her cheek. She reached out, her fingers hovering millimeters from Maren's waist, her body vibrating with the desperate urge to pull Maren into her arms and surrender. But she restrained herself, pulling her hand back and curling it into a tight fist at her side. "Trust me," Silas whispered, her voice hollow. "Just trust me to play this through." The night of the Vance Winter Gala arrived with unforgiving grandiosity. The estate's ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers, filled with noble families, media reporters, and elite investors. Maren stood near the service entrance dressed in her black maid's uniform, her stomach churning violently from early pregnancy nausea and suffocating grief. She watched Silas from across the crowded room. Silas looked striking in a midnight black tuxedo, standing beside Lady Victoria Sterling. To anyone else, Silas appeared composed and regal, but Maren saw the subtle tremor in her hands whenever she raised a champagne glass. At 9 o'clock, Vance took the stage, holding a microphone. "Welcome, esteemed guests," Eleanor's sharp, melodious voice echoed through the speakers. "Tonight, amid our grief for my sweet Julian, we look to the future. I am proud to announce the betrothal of my daughter, Silas Vance, to Lady Victoria Sterling." Applause erupted across the room. Maren felt as if the air had been sucked directly from her lungs. She gripped the edge of a serving tray, her knuckles white, her heart breaking into 1,000 bleeding pieces. Before the applause could fade, Eleanor smiled, a cold, lethal expression that made the hair on Maren's arms stand up. "And to ensure total transparency as our families merge," Eleanor continued smoothly, "we are clearing all outstanding personal liabilities within the Vance estate, including surrogate arrangements." Eleanor motioned to a footman, who began distributing formal printed press releases to the reporters in the front row. Maren's stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. A young footman passed her near the service hallway, dropping a copy of the release onto her tray. Maren's hands shook so violently the paper rattled. Her eyes skimmed the bold legal text at the top. "Official statement, Omega surrogacy agreement and parental waiver." Below it was Maren's full name, framing her not as Silas's partner, but as a hired, compensated surrogate carrying an heir for the Vance family line. And at the bottom of the page, stamped in heavy red ink, was a legal clause stating that Maren Vance had willingly surrendered all parental and custody rights upon the birth of the child in exchange for financial compensation. Attached to the back page was a copy of the signature document. The signature authorizing the surrender of Maren's baby was written in sharp, unmistakable black ink: Silas Vance. Maren's world shattered in an instant. The noise of the ballroom faded into a deafening, high-pitched ring. Blood roared in her ears, her vision blurred with hot, spilling tears. Silas hadn't bought her a quiet haven to protect her. Silas had signed away her child to secure her mother's corporate empire. Driven by a wave of raw, blinding agony, Maren turned and bolted down the service corridor toward Silas's private study. She slammed the heavy oak door behind her, clutching the paper to her chest, her body shaking with violent sobs. Seconds later, the door clicked open. Silas stepped into the room, her face pale, her suit jacket discarded as she rushed inside. "Maren." "You signed it," Maren sobbed, her voice a ragged, bleeding gasp as she held up the document. "You told me to trust you, and you signed away my baby." "Maren, listen to me." Silas took a fast, desperate step forward, her gray eyes wide with a terror Maren had never seen before. "That isn't what it looks like. My mother altered the drafts." "Don't touch me," Maren screamed, backing away until her hips hit the heavy mahogany desk. Silas didn't stop. In one sudden, fluid motion, she closed the distance, her broad frame trapping Maren against the edge of the desk. Silas reached out, her pale hands framing Maren's face, her thumbs desperately wiping away the tears streaming down Maren's burning cheeks. The heat of Silas's body slammed into Maren, heavy and suffocating, her alpha scent flaring with wild, unbridled desperation. "Look at me," Silas pleaded, her voice cracking, her forehead dropping down to press against Maren's. They were so close Maren could taste the faint bitterness of champagne on Silas's breath. Silas's chest heaved against Maren's, her fingers sliding deep into Maren's hair, holding her in place with a fierce, trembling grip. "I didn't sign that waiver. She forged my mark on the final page. You have to believe me." "Then tell them," Maren wept, her hands clutching Silas's lapels, her body shaking against the alpha's frame. "Walk out into that ballroom right now and tell them it's a lie. Tell them you love me. Tell them this is our child." Silas went dead rigid. Her eyes opened, staring into Maren's overflowing gaze from centimeters away. The silence between them stretched, thick, heavy, and agonizing. Silas's jaw flexed, her throat working as she swallowed hard. Out in the hallway, the heavy footsteps of Eleanor's private security guards echoed against the marble, drawing closer to the study door. Silas didn't move, she didn't turn toward the door, she didn't say a word. Maren felt the last fragile piece of her heart disintegrate inside her chest. The silence was her answer. Maren closed her eyes as a cold, lifeless calm washed over her. She pushed Silas back with all the strength left in her body, stepping away from the only woman she had ever loved. "I would rather die," Maren whispered softly, "than ever look at you again." The words hung in the suffocating space between them like a blade. "I would rather die than ever look at you again." Silas stood frozen, her hands still hovering in the empty air where Maren had pushed her away. Outside the heavy mahogany doors, the muffled murmurs of the gala and the rhythmic click of security boots drew closer. "Maren, please," Silas whispered. Her voice, usually an impenetrable fortress, sounded paper-thin. She took a step forward, reaching out to brush a stray tear from Maren's cheek. Maren flinched back from the touch, her chest heaving as if she were drowning. "Don't touch me. Don't ever touch me again." Silas's fingers hovered a fraction of an inch from Maren's burning skin. The heat between them vibrated with agonizing intensity, but Silas forced her hand to drop, her knuckles clenching until her nails bit into her palm. "If you run right now, my mother's guards will stop you at the gate. They have orders to detain you." "Then let them try," Maren spat, her throat raw, her hands trembling violently as she clutched her abdomen. Before Silas could answer, the study door swung open. Vance stepped into the room, flanked by two towering men in dark suits. Her sharp gaze swept over the scene, Silas standing disheveled with her coat off and Maren weeping against the edge of the desk. "That's enough," said smoothly, her tone as cold as winter frost. "Silas, your betrothed is waiting on the terrace for the formal toast. The press is asking questions. Go." Silas didn't move. She kept her gray eyes locked on Maren, her jaw set so hard the muscle twitched beneath her pale skin. "Leave us, mother, now." "You are playing a dangerous game, Silas," warned, stepping closer. "The sterling contract is on the table. One word from me, and the security detail escorting Miss Vance off the premises will hand her over to the Municipal Omega holding facility for unbonded vagrants." A wave of icy panic washed over Maren, making her stomach twist into a sickening knot. She looked at Silas, desperate for a sign, a single movement of defiance. Silas turned her head slowly toward her mother. Her face was a mask of perfect, stone-cold composure, but Maren saw the frantic, desperate pulse hammering in her neck. "I will handle the press," Silas said, her voice dropping into that smooth, terrifyingly flat register. "Give us 5 minutes, or I walk away from the sterling deal tonight." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but after a tense, agonizing silence, she gave a stiff nod and stepped back out into the corridor, leaving the door slightly ajar. The quiet returned, heavy and suffocating. Silas turned back to Maren. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them until her shadow completely engulfed Maren. She reached out, her fingers gently wrapping around Maren's wrist, not to restrain her, but to anchor herself. The touch burned. Maren tried to pull away, but Silas's grip remained firm yet infinitely gentle, her thumb tracing the rapid, erratic pulse in Maren's skin. "Listen to me carefully," Silas breathed, her face inches from Maren's. "There is a side door in the eastern servant quarters. It leads to the orchard path. The guards aren't posted there yet. Take my car key from the desk drawer." Maren stared at her, her tear-blurred eyes wide with confusion and bleeding grief. "What?" "I cannot walk out on that stage and deny the waiver tonight without my mother taking you into custody immediately," Silas murmured, her hot breath fanning across Maren's forehead. Her composure cracked for a split second, her gray eyes brimming with raw, unadulterated pain. "I need you safe. I need our child safe. Take the car and go to the cottage in Oakhaven. I will follow you as soon as I sever the sterling contract." "You expect me to run away and wait for you?" Maren whispered, a bitter, broken laugh escaping her lips. "After you stood there in silence, after you asked me to sign away my rights." "I am trying to keep you free." Silas's voice cracked, a rare, desperate plea breaking through her shell. She brought Maren's hand up, pressing Maren's palm directly over her own heart. Beneath the fine silk of Silas's shirt, her heart was beating at a terrifying, wild rhythm. "Do you feel that? I am terrified, Maren. I have never been terrified in my entire life until now." For a fraction of a second, Maren felt the temptation to yield, to lean into Silas's chest, to believe that this powerful, icy alpha could truly shield her from the world. The warmth of Silas's hand over hers made her core ache with a deep, hopeless longing. Then Maren looked down at the desk. It was an order to place Maren in a private, high-security medical facility under Silas's sole legal guardianship until the birth of the child. Silas hadn't planned on letting her go to Oakhaven. Silas was planning to lock her away for her own protection. The realization hit Maren like a physical blow, turning her blood to ice. Silas didn't see her as a partner. Silas saw her as something fragile to be managed, controlled, and hidden. "You really think you own me, don't you?" Maren whispered, her voice dangerously quiet. Silas frowned, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Maren." Maren didn't hesitate. She yanked her hand back, grabbed the heavy brass paperweight from the edge of the desk, and slammed it down onto the glass pitcher of water beside Silas. The glass shattered with a deafening crack. Water and sharp shards exploded across the mahogany desk, raining down onto the corporate documents. Silas gasped, stepping back instinctively as glass sprayed across her polished shoes. Before Silas or the guards outside could react, Maren bolted toward the private terrace doors behind the desk. She threw the brass latch open and stepped out into the freezing winter night. "Maren!" Silas screamed, her voice echoed off the high ceilings, a raw, frantic sound that tore through the quiet mansion. Maren didn't look back. Cold rain slammed into her face, soaking her thin maid's uniform in seconds, but she ran with everything she had. She sprinted down the slick stone steps, past the manicured hedges, and plunged directly into the dark, tangled woods surrounding the estate. Back in the study, Silas rushed to the open terrace doors. The icy rain whipped her hair into her eyes as she stared out into the pitch-black forest. She gripped the wet iron railing so tight her knuckles turned white, her chest heaving, a soundless, agonizing scream trapped in her throat. Behind her, Eleanor stepped into the room, looking at the broken glass and the open door with cold satisfaction. "She's gone, Silas. It's over. Come back to the gala." Silas slowly turned around. The softness, the vulnerability, the desperate plea, all of it had vanished from her face. Her gray eyes were completely dead, hollowed out by a sudden, terrifying emptiness. She reached down, picked up her discarded suit jacket, and pulled it on with precise mechanical motions. "Call the private security detail," Silas said, her voice dropping into a register so dark and emotionless it made even Eleanor freeze. "Track every road leading out of the county. If anyone touches her, I will tear this family down piece by piece." 3 months after fleeing into the freezing winter night, Maren lived in a cramped, damp apartment on the outskirts of Oakhaven. Her belly was noticeably rounded now, a fragile bump she cradled constantly while her mind replayed the sound of Silas's voice. Survival as an unbonded Omega in hiding was a daily trial of exhaustion, low fever, and bitter grief. She worked under an assumed name at a local logistics office, spending her nights at a rickety wooden desk. But Maren hadn't spent those 3 months merely hiding. Driven by a deep, bleeding fury, she had used her former access to the Vance library to painstakingly reassemble encrypted financial records. On a bleak Tuesday morning, the storm broke. Maren anonymously leaked 3 gigabytes of internal Vance Aldridge files to federal regulators and press outlets. The documents laid bare decades of systematic wage theft, illicit offshore holdings, and forced labor exploitation across 3 states. By noon, news tickers nationwide blared in bright red banner text, "VNCALDRIDG Enterprises under federal investigation. Stock collapses 60%. Sitting in her cold kitchen, watching the news broadcast on a flickering television, Maren's hands shook against her mug of warm tea. Her stomach twisted with a terrifying mixture of relief and absolute horror. She had done it. She had burned Silas's empire to the ground. That evening, a sudden wave of sharp, agonizing pain shot through Maren's abdomen. She collapsed onto the linoleum floor, her tea mug shattering into pieces. The sheer stress of the leak had pushed her body over the edge. She was barely 7 months pregnant. Gasping for air, tears streaming down her burning cheeks, Maren dragged herself to the hallway door and screamed for help before blacking out. When Maren opened her eyes, the stark, blinding white of a charity hospital ward greeted her. The smell of antiseptic was overwhelming, suffocating her senses. "You're awake," a nurse murmured softly, leaning over her bed. "You were in distress, but the doctors stabilized you. The baby, she was born early, but she's breathing." A quiet sob tore from Maren's throat. My baby, can I see her? Before the nurse could answer, the door to the private recovery room swung open. The air in the room instantly turned to liquid ice. Silas stood in the doorway. She was dressed in a pristine slate-gray wool coat, but the woman beneath it was unrecognizable. Silas was gaunt, her silver-blonde hair slightly unkempt, deep dark shadows bruised beneath her hollow gray eyes. The sheer destruction of her family's empire had aged her years in a matter of weeks, yet her posture remained terrifyingly straight. Maren's heart leaped into her throat, cold panic surging through her veins. She clutched the thin hospital blanket to her chest, her breathing turning fast and shallow. "Get out! How did you find me?" Silas didn't answer right away. She stepped into the room, her leather shoes clicking with slow, deliberate precision against the tile. She stopped beside the bed, looking down at Maren's pale, sweat-slicked face. Silas reached out, her pale hand hovering inches above Maren's forehead, her fingers trembling slightly in the air. For a fraction of a second, the cold stone mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of profound, agonizing tenderness. "You look pale," Silas murmured, her voice raspy, as if she hadn't spoken in days. Maren jerked her head away, flinching from the near touch. "Don't look at me like that. You ruined my life. Did you come here to finish it?" Silas slowly drew her hand back, tucking it into her coat pocket. Her expression hardened into an impenetrable wall of marble. "You leaked the files, Maren. You destroyed my mother's legacy. You bankrupted the estate." "I protected my people," Maren cried, her voice cracking, tears welling in her eyes. "You were going to let your mother crush Oakhaven. You lied to me." "I was liquidating my personal shares to buy out the workers' debt silently." Silas's voice cracked, a sudden, sharp snap of emotion that echoed off the sterile walls. She leaned over the bed, her hands resting on the metal safety rails, trapping Maren beneath her shadowed gaze. "I was tearing my own life apart to protect you and this child, and you gave my mother the weapon she needed to destroy us both." The intensity of Silas's presence made Maren's throat go bone dry. Their eyes locked, inches apart, charged with an unbearable weight of grief, anger, and a deep, lingering ache that neither could erase. "I don't care about your money," Maren whispered, her lip trembling. "I just wanted my baby. Leave us alone." Silas stared down at her for a long, agonizing silence. Then, slowly, she reached into her inner coat pocket and pulled out a crisp, white legal document stamped with a state seal. She laid it gently on the small table beside Maren's bed. "What is that?" Maren asked, her blood running cold, her stomach plunging into a dark void. "An emergency court order," Silas said smoothly, though her gray eyes were completely dead. "Because you are an unbonded, unemployed Omega with no permanent address, and because you are currently under federal witness questioning regarding the Vance leaks, the state has deemed you unable to provide adequate care." Maren stared at the paper, the black letters swimming before her eyes. "Full emergency sole custody granted to Silas Vance." "No," Maren breathed, a terrifying silent gasp. "No, no, no, Silas, please." "I am taking Clara home," Silas said quietly. "You can't do this," Maren screamed, throwing off the blanket, trying to push herself up, but her weakened body gave out, pain shooting through her core. Tears spilled down her burning cheeks as she grabbed Silas's sleeve, her knuckles turning white as she clung to the fine wool. "She's my daughter. Silas, don't take my baby. I'll do anything, please." Silas stood unmoving, letting Maren pull at her coat. She lowered her head, leaning down until her lips brushed against the shell of Maren's ear. Her breath was warm, but her words were ice. "You took my family's future, Maren," Silas whispered, her voice trembling with a dark, bitter grief. "I am taking ours." Silas gently, deliberately unclasped Maren's desperate fingers from her sleeve. She didn't look back as she turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind her with a soft, final click. Maren fell back onto the empty hospital bed, her chest heaving, her broken sobs echoing in the quiet, sterile room. 4 years altered everything. The Grand Vance Aldridge empire was a relic of the past, dismantled by federal fines and corporate ruin. Silas Vance lived in self-imposed exile, tucked away in a small, weathered cottage on the rocky northern coast. Gone were the tailored suits and armies of servants. She wore simple linen shirts with the sleeves rolled up, her silver blonde hair tied back loosely. But beneath her calm surface lay a hollowed-out woman, consumed by quiet, unending remorse. For 4 years, Silas raised Clara alone. Every milestone, Clara's first step, her first word, her laughter, was a bitter reminder of the woman she had stolen her from. Down in the valley, Maren had rebuilt herself from ashes. No longer a timid maid hiding her presence, she was now a key organizer for the regional labor union. Her eyes were sharper, her chin set firm. She had fought through endless legal motions, saving every cent to secure what the court had finally granted her: supervised visitation rights. The gravel crunching under the tires of Maren's second-hand car signaled her arrival at the cottage. When Maren stepped onto the porch, her heart pounded violently against her ribs. Her hands trembled as she straightened her coat, her throat going dry. She reached out and knocked twice on the wooden door. The door opened, and Silas stood there. The sight of her made Maren's breath hitch in her chest. Silas looked older, leaner, with fine lines around her slate-gray eyes. The silent pressure between them hit like a physical weight, thick with memories of dark library nights and bitter hospital corridors. "Maren," Silas said softly. Her voice was lower now, lacking its old noble bite. "I'm here for my scheduled hours," Maren replied, keeping her voice strictly professional, refusing to acknowledge the ache in her core. "Is Clara ready?" Silas stepped aside, opening the door wider. "She's in the living room. She knows you're coming." Maren stepped over the threshold, her scent, soft rain and sweet clover, instantly filling the entry hall. Silas's chest tightened, her jaw flexing as she swallowed hard. For a brief second, Silas reached out, her pale hand hovering as if to help Maren off with her coat, but Maren brushed past her without a single touch, maintaining a cold, unyielding boundary. In the living room, a 4-year-old girl with thick dark curls and Silas's striking gray eyes sat on a hand-woven rug, carefully stacking wooden blocks. Maren's knees buckled, a quiet sob caught in her throat as she sank to the floor. "Clara." The little girl looked up, her wide eyes blinking before a soft smile lit up her face. "Mommy." 4 years of hollowed grief evaporated as Maren gathered Clara into her arms, pressing her face into the little girl's hair, breathing in the innocent warmth. Silas stood near the kitchen archway, leaning against the frame. Her face remained composed, but her throat worked continuously as she fought back the tears burning behind her eyes. For 2 hours, Maren existed in a world made only of Clara. They drew pictures with colored pencils on the coffee table, Clara chattering happily about her drawings while Maren listened with undivided devotion. Silas remained in the room, maintaining a quiet distance, preparing tea in complete silence. She set a steaming ceramic cup on the low table near Maren, her fingers lingering on the wooden surface just inches from Maren's knee. Maren didn't look up, but her skin prickled from the heat radiating off Silas. The silence stretched between them, heavy, charged, and suffocating. "She has your laugh," Silas said quietly, breaking the stillness. Maren's hand paused over Clara's drawing pad. "She has your eyes," she replied flatly, her tone icy and transactional. "The rest I intend to teach her myself." The subtle blow landed. Silas's eyes darkened slightly, but she simply nodded, accepting the mark without defense. "She likes the ocean. I take her to the tide pools on weekends." "I don't care where you take her, Silas," Maren said, finally lifting her eyes to meet Silas's unblinking gaze. "You have her 4 days a week because a judge declared it so, not because you earned it." Silas didn't flinch. Instead, she took a slow step forward, kneeling beside the table to collect the discarded crayons. As she reached for a red pencil near Maren's hand, her fingers brushed against Maren's wrist. The contact was brief, but an intense electric jolt shot straight through Maren. Maren pulled her hand back instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs, her cheeks flaring with a sudden, unwanted heat. Silas's gaze rose to meet hers, holding her captive in a charged, breathless moment. Silas didn't apologize. Her fingers hovered over the carpet, her expression filled with a quiet, devastating longing. Before the tension could break, Clara yawned loudly, rubbing her small eyes and leaning her head against Maren's shoulder. "It's her nap time," Silas murmured, her voice raspy as she stood up. Maren held Clara tight, rocking her gently until the little girl's breathing slowed into soft, steady rhythms. Maren carried her upstairs, laying her gently on the small bed before stepping back into the hallway. Silas was waiting at the top of the stairs, holding Clara's small stuffed rabbit. "Maren," Silas whispered, stepping closer until only a few inches separated them in the narrow corridor. The familiar, deep scent of cedarwood wrapped around Maren, making her stomach twist into knots. "The house in the valley. I transferred the deed to your name last month. The union paperwork went through." Maren stared at her, her breath hitching. "What?" "I don't expect it to change anything," Silas said, her voice dropping into a soft, vulnerable register. She reached out, her fingers hovering near Maren's cheek, desperate to touch the skin she had spent 4 years yearning for. "I just wanted you to have a home, real security." Maren felt her chest tightening with a sudden, suffocating panic. The proximity, the softness in Silas's eyes, it threatened to undo every wall she had built around her bleeding heart. "Stop it," Maren breathed, her throat dry. "Stop trying to buy your way out of what you did." "I am not buying anything," Silas murmured, stepping even closer until her front brushed the hem of Maren's sweater. Her hand rested gently against the doorframe beside Maren's head, trapping her in the warm, dangerous orbit of her body. Silas's gray eyes searched Maren's face, dropping down to her trembling lips. "I am trying to give you back what I stole." Maren's heart beat so wildly she thought Silas could hear it. For a single, terrifying second, Maren leaned in slightly, drawn by the irresistible gravity of the only person she had ever loved. The air between their lips burned with an unbearable, suffocating heat. Then, a harsh, unexpected knock echoed from the heavy front door downstairs. Silas froze, her eyes snapping wide as the moment shattered. She stepped back instantly, her composure snapping into place like iron. "Stay here." Silas walked down the stairs, with Maren following quietly behind to watch from the landing. Silas opened the front door. Standing on the porch, wrapped in a fur coat and flanked by 2 high-priced city lawyers, was Vance. "Hello, Silas," Eleanor said, a cruel, triumphant smile stretching across her face. "I see you're still living in dirt. I'm here to inform you that the High Court has reopened the custody filings for my granddaughter." The heavy wooden door felt like the only barrier between survival and total ruin. "Get off my property, Mother," Silas said. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles burned white where she gripped the doorframe. Eleanor stepped over the threshold anyway, her leather soles clicking sharply against the rustic hardwood. "I am here to save my family's remaining bloodline. You live in a hovel, Silas, and Miss Vance." Eleanor's eyes drifted toward the staircase landing, where Maren stood frozen, her stomach twisting into a sickening knot. "Is an unbonded, radical agitator under active federal scrutiny. Neither of you is fit to raise a Vance heir." Cold panic flooded Maren's veins. She rushed down the stairs, her throat bone dry as she stepped between Eleanor and the front hall. "She is my daughter, you won't touch her." "The family law tribunal disagrees," Eleanor replied smoothly, signaling one of her attorneys, who pulled a thick, blue-bound portfolio from a leather briefcase. "We have petitioned for emergency grandmaternal guardianship. The filing cites your history of corporate sabotage, Maren, alongside Silas's documented mental instability following Julian's death. Clara will be placed in my legal care by Friday." Maren's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her breathing turned fast and shallow as she looked at Silas, desperate for any sign of resistance. Silas remained motionless. Her pale face was a stone mask, but beneath her tailored cuffs, her fingers twitched, a tiny, involuntary tremor of pure terror. She looked at Eleanor, then turned her gray gaze to Maren. The silent eye contact held a suffocating weight of shared history, grief, and an agonizing realization. Eleanor's legal trap was virtually airtight. "Leave us," Silas commanded quietly. "The papers are served, get out." Eleanor smiled a thin, cruel line and turned toward the door. "See you in court on Thursday, my dear." When the door clicked shut, the cottage fell into a deafening, terrifying silence. Maren collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase, her face buried in her trembling hands as ragged sobs tore from her chest. "She's going to take her. Silas, she's going to take Clara, after everything." Silas walked over, kneeling on the hard floor in front of Maren. For the first time in 4 years, the untouchable noble alpha looked completely stripped of her armor. Silas reached out, her pale hand halting just millimeters above Maren's knee. "I won't let her," Silas whispered. Maren lifted her tear-stained face, her eyes red and burning. "How? Your family's money built those courts. Your mother owns those judges. We have nothing left to fight her with." Silas didn't pull her hand back. Instead, she lowered her palm until it rested gently against Maren's knee. The heat of her skin seeped through the fabric of Maren's trousers, sending a sharp, intoxicating shock straight to Maren's heart. Maren's chest heaved, her pulse racing wildly, but for once, she didn't flinch away. "I have one thing left," Silas murmured, her voice dropping into a raspy, quiet hum. Her thumb brushed the side of Maren's knee, a brief, reverent touch before she slowly pulled her hand back and stood up. "Go home to Clara, Maren. Be at the Central Courthouse on Thursday morning." Thursday morning arrived under a heavy, ash-gray sky. The grand marble halls of the State Family Tribunal echoed, with the frantic murmurs of press reporters and high society observers. Maren sat at the petitioning table, her hands clutched tightly in her lap, her stomach churning with cold, metallic nausea. Beside her table, Eleanor sat surrounded by 4 high-powered attorneys, looking triumphantly composed. At precisely 9 o'clock, Silas entered the courtroom. She wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, the first time Maren had seen her in her formal noble attire in 4 years. Her silver-blonde hair was tied back with razor-sharp precision. She looked distant, regal, and terrifyingly cold. But as she walked past Maren's table to take the witness stand, her hand brushed against the back of Maren's chair, her pinky finger lingering against Maren's shoulder for a fleeting, agonizing second. "Miss Vance," the presiding judge spoke, leaning over his high bench. "Your mother's counsel has presented evidence suggesting that neither you nor the child's biological mother can provide a stable, lawful environment. Do you have a statement before we ruling on custody?" Silas stood up straight in the wooden box. She adjusted her cuffs, her expression unreadable. "I do, Your Honor," Silas said. Her voice echoed clear and firm through the cavernous room. "My mother's petition relies on the assertion that I am an innocent victim of corporate negligence, and that Maren Vance is a sole criminal actor." Eleanor's smile faded slightly, her brows pulling together. Silas reached into her breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, sealed manila envelope. She laid it onto the clerk's desk. "Inside that envelope," Silas continued smoothly, "are the original, unredacted corporate ledgers from the Vance Aldridge estate dating back 10 years. They contain my personal, authorized signatures approving the illegal offshore transfers, tax evasions, and labor violations." A collective, sharp gasp erupted across the gallery. Reporters surged forward, camera shutters clicking like a swarm of locusts. Maren's breath hitched in her throat, her eyes widening in absolute horror. "Silas, no." "Silas, sit down," Eleanor shouted, breaking her regal composure as she slammed her hands onto her desk, her face flushing bright red. "She's insane. Strike that from the record." "I am entirely sane, Mother," Silas said, her voice dropping into a quiet, lethal register as she turned her head to look directly at Eleanor. "I signed those documents to protect the family firm. I committed those felonies, and I am entering a full, unconditional guilty plea to federal authorities today." The courtroom erupted into total chaos. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. Maren stood up, her legs shaking so violently she had to hold onto the table for support. Blood roared in her ears. Silas was surrendering everything: her name, her remaining assets, her freedom. By pleading guilty to federal charges, Silas was willfully accepting a multi-year prison sentence. And because a convicted federal felon could not hold legal claims, nor could an accomplice like Eleanor benefit from the estate's ruined assets, Eleanor's petition for Clara was rendered completely void under state law. Silas stepped down from the witness box, ignoring her mother's hysterical screams and the flashing cameras. 2 uniformed federal marshals stepped forward, clicking heavy steel handcuffs around Silas's pale wrists. Silas walked toward the exit aisle, stopping right in front of Maren. The distance between them shrank to nothing. The heavy scent of cedarwood wrapped around Maren, thick and suffocating. Silas lifted her bound hand slightly, her long, pale fingers reaching out until her thumb gently touched the pulse point on Maren's neck. The skin was burning hot, her thumb tracing the rapid, wild beat beneath Maren's jaw. "Silas, why?" Maren sobbed, tears spilling down her burning cheeks, her hands reaching out to grab the lapels of Silas's jacket. "Why would you do this? You'll go to prison." Silas leaned down, pressing her forehead against Maren's in front of the entire court, in front of the cameras, in front of the world. Her gray eyes were brimming with unshed, agonizing tears, her breath fanning hot and desperate across Maren's trembling lips. "Because it is the only way to make you clean," Silas whispered, her voice cracking with a devastation so raw it tore Maren's heart to shreds. She slipped a single piece of paper into Maren's coat pocket, the finalized, irrevocable sole guardianship deed granting Maren total legal custody of Clara forever. "I locked you away once to save myself. Let me do this, so you and Clara can finally be free." Before Maren could speak, before her lips could press against Silas's in the desperate, bleeding kiss hanging between them, the marshals pulled Silas back, leading her through the heavy side doors as the courtroom doors slammed shut. 18 months in minimum security federal custody stripped away the last remaining traces of Silas Vance's noble status. The woman who stepped off the late afternoon commuter train onto the quiet wooden platform of Oak Haven Station wore a faded dark coat, dark denim, and scuffed leather boots. Her silver-blonde hair was cut short at her collarbones, her jaw leaner, her slate-gray eyes wide and quiet as she looked out at the small valley town. She carried a single canvas duffel bag over her shoulder. She had no corporate empire, no wealth, no family title, and no legal claim to anything in this world. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and wet soil. Silas stopped on the edge of the platform, her breath hitching in her chest as her eyes landed on the figure waiting near the station bench. Maren stood beneath the yellow glow of a street lamp. She wore a thick wool sweater and an olive coat, her dark hair blowing softly in the evening breeze. Standing beside her, wearing a small yellow raincoat and clutching a plush rabbit, was 5-year-old Clara. For a long, agonizing silence, no one moved. The train's engine chugged softly as it pulled away, leaving only the sound of wind rustling through the nearby pines. Silas stood frozen, her fingers clenching tight around the strap of her bag. A familiar, cold panic spiked in her chest, accompanied by a wave of intense, suffocating longing that made her throat go bone dry. She felt stripped bare, terrified to step forward, terrified to ruin the peace she had given up everything to secure. Maren took the first step. She walked slowly toward the platform steps, leading Clara by the hand. As the distance closed, Silas looked down at Clara, her gray eyes filling with a sudden, overwhelming warmth that made her throat work violently. "Hi, Clara," Silas whispered, her raspy voice trembling slightly. Clara peeked out from behind Maren's coat, her gray eyes blinking up at the taller woman before a soft, shy smile touched her lips. "Are you coming home with us?" The simple word, home, hit Silas like a physical strike. Her chest tightened so hard she almost lost her footing on the wooden plank. She looked up at Maren, her jaw set, her expression instantly shifting into her familiar, quiet composure to hide the raw bleeding vulnerability beneath. "Only if your mother allows it," Silas murmured, her voice steady but paper-thin. Maren stared at Silas, taking in every small detail. The subtle lines around Silas's eyes, the faint scar near her collar, the quiet humility replacing her once untouchable noble pride. Maren's stomach twisted into a complex knot of grief, residual bitterness, and an undeniable, deep-rooted ache that 18 months of separation had failed to erase. "The cottage has an extra room," Maren said, her voice quiet, transactional, yet devoid of its old icy hostility. And Clara missed her father's architectural drawings. Silas nodded once, a brief, tight movement. "Thank you." They walked back to Maren's car in near silence. Silas insisted on placing her duffel in the trunk herself, her long fingers brushing against Maren's as they both reached for the latch at the same time. The contact was brief, a fleeting touch of cold skin against warm, but a sharp, electric shock zapped straight up Maren's arm. Maren gasped softly, pulling her hand back into her coat pockets, her pulse racing wildly against her ribs. Silas didn't pull away immediately. Her bare fingers hovered over the metal handle, her gray eyes darkening as she held Maren's gaze in the dim streetlight before she closed the trunk with a soft click. The drive through Oak Haven was quiet, filled only with Clara's soft chattering from the backseat about her kindergarten drawings. When they arrived at the coastal cottage, the small home Silas had gifted Maren before the trial, night had fully fallen. After putting a sleepy Clara to bed upstairs, Maren walked down into the living room. A single warm lamp illuminated the space. Silas stood by the glass patio doors, staring out at the dark, roaring ocean waves breaking against the cliffs below. She had discarded her coat, standing in a plain black sweater. Her posture was straight, but her broad shoulders were slumped with an exhaustion that ran deep into her bones. Maren stepped softly onto the rug, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. She approached the window, setting one cup on the wooden sill beside Silas. Silas didn't turn her head, but her gaze shifted in the reflection of the glass, tracking Maren's movement. "I didn't expect you to come to the station." "I know," Maren whispered, stepping closer until she stood right beside Silas. The familiar scent of cedarwood, now mixed with the crisp tang of autumn rain, wrapped around Maren, making her heart beat violently against her ribs. "I spent 4 years hating you, Silas," Maren said, her voice dropping into a raw, honest register. "I spent 4 years believing you were just like your mother, that you only cared about power and control." Silas closed her eyes for a brief second, a flicker of profound pain crossing her features. "I gave you reason to." "You did," Maren agreed softly. She turned her body, facing Silas directly. "You took my daughter in a hospital room, you kept secrets. You tried to manage my life like a corporate asset." Silas turned slowly to face her. The space between them shrank to inches. Silas's hands remained clasped firmly behind her back, a gesture of strict self-restraint, refusing to impose her presence on Maren ever again. "I know," Silas murmured, her voice trembling with an uncharacteristic, soft vulnerability. "I destroyed the only good thing I ever owned. I spent 18 months in a cell realizing that my silence was a crime." Maren looked into those slate-gray eyes, seeing no trace of the arrogant noble alpha who had once commanded her in the estate library. Standing before her was just a woman who had bled herself dry, surrendered her fortune, her reputation, and her freedom to undo her sins and protect her child. "You didn't undo what happened," Maren whispered, her throat dry, her lip trembling as tears filled her eyes. "The scars are still here, Silas. I still remember the winter night I ran into the woods. I still remember the hospital room." "I know," Silas breathed, her breath fanning hot across Maren's cheek. "I don't ask you to forget. I don't ask for forgiveness." "Then what do you ask for?" Maren sobbed softly, stepping closer until her front brushed the fabric of Silas's sweater. Silas's breath hitched. She slowly unclasped her hands, bringing them forward. Her pale, long fingers hovered millimeters above Maren's waist, vibrating with an intense, desperate need to pull Maren into her arms, yet held back by sheer force of will. "A second chance," Silas whispered, her voice cracking as her gray eyes searched Maren's overflowing gaze. "To earn what I stole, to be a father to Clara, to stand beside you, not above you." Maren stared at her, her heart hammering so wildly she felt dizzy. The heavy silence stretched between them, thick with 4 years of agony, betrayal, sacrifice, and an enduring, unbroken bond that had survived the total ruin of 2 worlds. Slowly, deliberately, Maren reached out. She didn't push Silas away. Her small, warm hand reached up, her fingers sliding up the lapel of Silas's sweater to rest gently against the pulse point on Silas's neck. Silas gasped, a shudder running down her spine at the touch. The heat of Maren's palm seeped into her skin, grounding her after years of isolation. Silas leaned down, her forehead dropping to press gently against Maren's. They stood in the warm light of the cottage, their breaths mingling, their hearts beating in frantic, matching rhythms, lips millimeters apart on the threshold of a long, hard-won future. "Stay," Maren whispered against Silas's skin.